My name's Thomas Mayo, and I'm just going to deliver this short talk for search members and any comrades that are wondering about how to handle objections. We're doing some phone banking, and I know that people are having conversations on the streets and in your workplaces, all around the place, and we need more of that. And so for you guys that might come across these objections, I hope this short talk will help you. One of the first objections, actually I'll start with the objections that come from the right wing, and I won't spend much time on them. Firstly, third chamber to Parliament, we know that's untrue. It's an advisory body, and we'll address how some people say that an advisory body is weak, and I'll explain why that's strong. But the initial thing is that it is not a third chamber to Parliament. That is an absolute lie. The other argument that you might hear from the right wing is that equality already exists, that by introducing a race, special voice for First Nations people, it is introducing race into the Constitution. Briefly, we know that equality does not exist in this country. If you believe that equality exists in this country, yet we have these gaps between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people in health, in education, in life expectancy, then you must be racist, because you're ignoring that there is a problem with equality. In the Constitution, there is section 5126, and that is the race power, and that is the power for the federal government to make special laws about a race of people. So the Constitution is already racist by seeking a constitutional right to a voice, to be able to have a political influence that is much stronger than today. That is how we can address the way that the race power is used to our detriment far too often. So equality doesn't exist, and it is not a third chamber to Parliament. Now, the arguments you might hear from more progressive people, firstly, let's start with that notion that if the voice is only advisory to Parliament, then it is weak. I will explain it like this. If we were to seek more than advisory, then that would be a third chamber to Parliament. We are not seeking a third chamber to Parliament because we know it's impossible, which is why those from the right have been using it as a fear-mongering tactic. It is a simple fact, the simple fact of the lay of the land. If you really mapped what people were thinking, they would never support a referendum to create a third chamber that is just Indigenous people, as much as we would love that power. So therefore, the voice, the representative body, must be only advisory. Now, does an advisory voice mean that it is weak? No, it doesn't. Unions, for example, are not more than advisory to the Parliament. No organisation in this country is more than advisory to Parliament. The High Court is the thing that comes the closest, but that's only to keep the Parliament to the Constitution. The power in the voice comes from its constitutional underpinning, which means that it is protected from hostile governments. The power in the voice is its ability, or that it creates the ability, for First Nations to come together through representatives that they choose, representatives that they can hold accountable, and then go forth with coherent positions on how things should be, what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, what funding is needed and where, and then be able to campaign for that and punish politicians that ignore our advice. That is where the power comes from. It is important to note that this type of voice does not exist for First Nations right now. The last voice or representative body with that sort of power that existed was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. A hostile government, John Howard, got rid of it as soon as he could. So never accept this argument that the voice is weak that we're talking about because it's only advisory. I hope I've explained that well. Another objection is sovereignty. You may hear some people say that by being included in the Constitution undermines, diminishes, or cedes our sovereignty. Again, this is completely untrue. Our sovereignty has existed for over 100,000 years. You cannot undo that connection to country You cannot make our identity disappear with an amendment to a law in this system today. The Constitution does not change who we are. There's several ways that you can be confident or can argue this case. Firstly, that first point there, you can go to the you can go to the Uluru Statement to address that. The Uluru Statement says that this sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto and will one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. And so the Uluru Statement basically addresses that and says that our sovereignty is something that is deeper than any law, any attempts of genocide, any attempts of forced assimilation. Another example of why our sovereignty, we can be confident that First Nations sovereignty is not affected by constitutional empowerment of a First Nations voice, is to look to international examples. There are many countries, or there are countries in this world that have, that are based on colonies, that have moved on and have constitutions that recognise First Nations place in those countries. Scandinavian countries has a voice to Parliament, the Scandi Parliament. The Colombia, Canada, for example, those First Nations did not suddenly disappear from the face of the planet when they were recognised in the constitutions of those nations. New Zealand, lastly, doesn't have a constitution. There are countries without constitutions, but they have founding documents. And the Treaty of Waitangi is a founding document, well entrenched in the New Zealand political and legal system, and that has not caused the Māori to disappear. In fact, it empowers them. Another example of sovereignty you can use is 67 counted First Nations people as Australian citizens after a decades-long campaign by our elders. Again, with constitutional change that counted us in the census as Australian citizens, did not diminish or cede our sovereignty. In fact, it gave us great confidence to win the fights that we have around land rights and many other things, medical services, legal services, the list goes on. Another objection that you might hear about is that the Uluru Statement was was developed through a flawed process, that it was rigged, that some people weren't invited. Let me address that now. Of course, some people weren't invited. There was 700,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, and there is no such thing as a process that is not flawed. The process to Uluru was not perfect, but it was brilliant. It was designed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and experts. Experts both academic and experts from many decades of struggle on the streets and taking it, public dissent. Professor Megan Davis designed the process. There was a formula to 100 participants to ensure that there was a cross-section of views and experiences represented. One thing that is explained by the experts that design this process, such as Professor Megan Davis, is that you cannot have an open invitation to such a deliberative dialogue or series of dialogues around the country, because then you risk a strong ideological and dominant Indigenous group skewing the deliberations and silencing those that advocate in a different way. And so that was really important. We had to have gender balance, we had to have a balance of people with different experiences and ways that they advocate. The healers, the warriors, they all had to be heard. Those are the main objections that I think you'll hear about. I think, you can ask an open question in response to that last one. When is the perfect process? How do we bring 700,000 people together in one process? When will you get the money? Where's the campaign to do that very resource intensive thing? The most important thing that we can focus on is achieving a constitutionally enshrined voice. Just to summarise to finish, constitutionally enshrined voice gives us a representative body, representatives that we choose, that we hold accountable, that by being protected in the Constitution, that is mandated through a referendum, a double majority of the Australian people, will have the power to take us forward like we've never been able to before. So support the Uluru Statement, get out there and fight for a voice. Thanks for your solidarity.